technology is an enabler of a business model and a strategy. And if you don't start with thinking about what that should be, you're in for a lot of trouble. So many companies are treating AI like this magic AI dust, and you sort of sprinkle it on what you're doing right now, and oh, it's a feature there, and there's a little magic wand, and uh, yeah, that's nice, and some of that might be worthwhile. Although, of course, there's a lot of back end hidden costs that people ignore. AI is part of the answer. It's not the full answer. You're going to need to change human behaviors as well, likely, and maybe some other technologies. But if you don't start out with those right questions, you end up likely at a wrong answer.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast. Along with my co-host Michael Watson, I'm VJ Marotra, and I'm here to welcome you. In addition to welcoming you, our loyal audience, I also want to welcome today's guest, Steve Wunker. Steve spent a lot of time over the last 20 plus years thinking about innovation, technology, and the way organizations are designed. He's worked with Clay Christensen around the notions of disruptive innovation. And most recently, he's written a book with Jonathan Brill called The Octopus and the AI Organization. And because one of the key themes in my Burning Man camp is the octopus, shout out to the Octogen, our camp leader, Steve's title caught my attention right away. Well, I'm sure we're going to be talking about the octopus further as we get into it. So I want to throw it over to Mike to get us started.
Yeah, let's just start with that. Welcome, Steve. And, you've got kind of a funny name for your book. Can you explain, what is how Octopus relates to the AI organization?
So I was searching around for a while with my co-author, Jonathan Brill, for a good framework for how people can think about what an AI-infused organization is going to look like. And Jonathan, he's the futurist at Amazon, and he's been talking for about 4 years now about how octopuses are hyper adaptable, which they are. And I mean, we all need to be hyper adaptable, but that wasn't quite it. And we looked into octopus biology just because, I mean, hey, I didn't know much about octopus biology. Why not? And it was perfect. And it's bizarre. So an octopus has 9 brains. It's got one central brain and then a brain in each of its arms, which means that each arm can sense and think and act locally. And yet there's a nerve ring that connects all the arms. So they've got total contextual awareness about what the other arms are doing. And then the central brain can focus on the big strategic stuff, which isn't opening up a clam, but it's how do I escape away from that shark? So it's a model of distributed intelligence. And what that enables, this massively parallel, rapid action where you have all this contextual awareness and the ability to coordinate still.
Wow. So these are agents, basically, these brains you're talking.
They are. Each arm is an agent. And, these agents can actually regrow themselves, which is pretty cool. But we don't need to get into that. Look, it's a great analogy for what AI looks like in a truly distributed organization.
And just to kind of drill down on that a bit more, when we talk about distributed intelligence and contextual information, that's one thing, but there's something more there. It feels like we're also distributing authority. Right?
That's right. If we're going to make that
call,
you've got to distribute authority, clear decision rights, and boundaries around how far people can go. Let me talk by another analogy. Back in 1900 in the Navy, a captain of a ship had a tremendous amount of autonomy. He could take an admiral's orders and sort of go out and execute on them to the best that he could. And by 1930, that had almost entirely gone away. It was due to one form of technological progress, which was the radio. Because admirals could give orders, they did. And that is a human tendency, right? And so AI can work in the opposite direction because it brings information to the right people at the right time. The big bosses can say they're the right people and they want to micromanage the algorithm, see everything that's going on in the organization. But I hope they don't do that. That is not going to let you be a fast acting, hyper adaptable organization, which is what you need to be in a super disruptive time.
There's another piece to that that I think is the underlying assumption that you, far from the field, have by wit of experience or in the 21st century, large data set, complex model, all the information needed for that decision, that there's no other information that's outside of your knowledge set. Um, Whereas the octopus model essentially says you, brain number six, have got everything in front of you. I can't even see some of those things. You're authorized to go.
Yes, that's right. So, look, ideally, the information set would be in a nice data lake and it can be easily shared and you can bring structured, unstructured data. Easier said than done, right? But there is a lot of low hanging fruit that AI can help enable. Let me give you an example of something that is just dead simple, but yet an organization wasn't doing it. I was talking recently with a big med tech company, and we were talking about different use cases of AI, and some were pretty futuristic. And the head of sales for North America said, well, what if we could equip our sales reps so that when they leave a hospital, rather than waiting 5 hours to get home and typing up a paragraph into Salesforce, they could just take a voice note on everything that was there that happened. And that can get automatically imported into Salesforce, and then the marketing teams can have full visibility to that. Well, I mean, you could have done that 2 years ago, right? This is pretty
Right.
dead easy, and yet it's not being done. But, by doing that, you then enable this, richness of information that wasn't there before, and the flowing of information around an organization. So you're not talking about an account in really abstract terms, but you've really got the full contextual model there.
Yeah, I like how you frame this. I've heard you talk about this before. Like when you brainstorm sort of futuristic ideas, it also surfaces this easy stuff, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact. Like, yes, this is a good mechanism for talking about everything, and then if something easy comes up, like let's just do that. That's been around for 5 years. We know how to do that. Let's just implement it and get that savings and move on to something else. So
A lot of the big wins I'm seeing are in profoundly unsexy, but very important things. So you take a hospital again, patient scheduling, uh, determining when a patient is likely to get discharged, and do we have the nurses on hand for that? Basic things like that that are not going to kill anybody if they get it wrong. So,
yeah,
the risk level isn't going to scare people away, and doesn't have a tremendous amount of dependencies on a lot of data, but it still just needs to get done.
right.
And has, from actually research that I've worked on, has a huge impact on actual capacity,
Oh, yeah.
decision making there, and really expensive resources and how they're utilized.
So
Well, so
let me ask a question about the octopus model real quick. So there's always this debate in the communities we're in for a data science or a decision science team. Like, where do you put this team? Do you put them centrally? Do you put them decentralized? Like, how does that work? How does that thinking fit in with the octopus model of how an organization should be? Like, does it have an opinion? It seems like it should be decentralized, but you must have more to say than just that.
That is an excellent question. I think it really depends on the context. So, if the organization has very decentralized, distinct sorts of operations, like, I know, an airline where you're flying passengers and cargo, but the baggage handling is its own thing. Having
Yeah,
this centralized decision science group may not make a whole lot of sense. And probably those business units don't talk to each other very much. But if you take it to another example, that med tech company, well, you're selling the same stuff, and yeah, you have to have sales and marketing and R&D, but they've all got to collaborate on everything. Otherwise, you're going to get disconnected really fast. Then I would absolutely want to get it centralized. Uh, Look, the information needs to be decentralized. Ultimately, you can centralize it through your infrastructure. The execution is ultimately going to be decentralized, but capabilities where you put those, it really depends on how people interrelate. You don't want to have to create a whole lot of railroad track inside an organization where the track's already run in other directions.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I've heard one person describe it as like you decentralize for a while and so you can figure out what works. Then you centralize it so that you can get the other legs of the octopus, knowing what the good leg did. And then so central then you decentralize to get the entrepreneurship or the innovation going. I mean, it probably never settled.
Look,
So,
ultimately, this stuff should just get mainstreamed. It's like social media was 15 years ago. 100 years ago, or more like 120 years ago, companies had chief electrification officers. And I don't
Okay.
know of any anymore. We sort of take it for
Right.
granted. We all know how to use it. So ultimately, you want to work yourself out of a job that way, but that's going to take a little while.
so we've been talking now so far around kind of centralized versus decentralized org structures, but those things are also kind of decision variables. Those are things we get to decide. And I'm interested in, Steve, from your perspective, what I see is people treating AI as a technology rather than a central organizing principle for their business and their business model. Why is that?
It is amazing how often people make the same mistake. Right? That they did it throughout efforts at digital transformation. They've done it before that too, right? Uh, Technology is an enabler of a business model and a strategy. And if you don't start with thinking about what that should be, you're in for a lot of trouble. So many companies are treating AI like this magic AI dust, and you sort of sprinkle it on what you're doing right now, and oh, it's a feature there, and there's a little magic wand, and uh, that's nice, and some of that might be worthwhile. Although, of course, there's a lot of back end hidden costs that people ignore. But that's not how you get transformation. Really, people need to be asking, how does AI change my competitive picture? How does it change what I need to be special in? What makes us really special as an organization? And then how do we operate? And then AI is part of the answer. It's not the full answer. You're going to need to change human behaviors as well, likely, and maybe some other technologies. But if you don't start out with those right questions, you end up likely at a wrong answer.
I guess just because you're in this space, I have this hypothesis that a lot of this is just leadership's failure of imagination.
And fear that they don't know the answer, and so they won't venture one. None of us know the answer, right? There's some wrong answers that we can identify, but we know the trend directions, and that's what we've got to work towards, and just have a little bit of flexibility at adjusting as the things become more clear.
Yeah, so let me ask about the creativity a little bit. So I want to come to another one of your books, which I think you bring into a lot of your work, is the jobs to be done.
Yeah,
Um, and it seems like if you could
right
explain,
here.
like,
I can plug two books at once. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate
yeah,
that.
yeah, no, I'm trying to help you out here. So
I'm also a
I
big
I like the idea of the jobs to be done. If you could explain like just what that is for people who are not familiar with it. And then also how do you use that in a creative way to get people to think bigger about like how AI can now come in and solve some of these problems when you're thinking about it as a jobs to be done point of view rather than some other point of view?
So, jobs to be done is a concept that was popularized by Clay Christensen, who, as you mentioned, I worked with him for 6 years. I led his tech practice, and the central thesis is that people aren't out there buying products and services. We shouldn't segment that way. We should segment based on what fundamentally people are trying to accomplish. So let's look past the world as it is and look to underlying motivations. So that works when you're taking that external customer lens. When you're looking internally, the analogy is we need to look at the fundamental units of work that need to get done and what are the different processes that are required. And then step back and say, how can AI play a role in terms of taking over some processes or at least joining with people? You know, we're, we have these org charts that are actually a legacy of steam railways back in the 1850s is when they were created. And,
Right.
they've got all our nice little cones. But the reality of work these days is it doesn't happen in cones. It occurs horizontally across an organization. And so there's just this total mismatch between org chart and the way work actually gets done. So if we're going to reform the way work gets done, we have to look at how it actually gets done today, which means saying, how does things actually go through the organization? And then let's get radical and really think about how AI can totally remake this, not, put a little grease in the machine, but rework the machine and see what's possible from first principles. Now, yeah, you can't do that with everything in the organization all at once, so it's going to die.
Right.
But you do that with a half dozen key workflows. You get that fixed, and then you do the next half dozen, and so on. That's how real change happens.
And I would also think that the jobs to be done too, like reframes it when you're talking to a company, you're not directly threatening someone. You're not going to say, how can AI replace Mike? You're saying like what job has to be done? And then I suspect when people get into it, correct me if I'm wrong, you figure out that like, my job has like 80 different things and like I can automate 30 of them, but there's still all these other things. I might have to redesign what I do. Is that sort of what you're seeing when you have that framework of coming into a problem?
Yeah, marketing department, we've got to create an advertising campaign for this service line. How are we going to work with the service line and get that out the door? Sales, we need to optimize pricing given a customer's capex versus opex preferences. So, yeah, we're not taking away anybody's job there, but we're thinking about who all needs to be involved in that. And then how can you redo that in a way that is going to be a lot faster and better, maybe cheaper as well. But, that's a product of doing it usually faster and better at the same time.
So I'd love to take this from the conceptual level to an example. Let's talk about HelloFresh. And what was the problem that HelloFresh was trying to address with AI up front? Where did this start?
Yeah. So I've written about them in a couple articles in Forbes. So HelloFresh is the world's largest meal kit delivery company. And they did great in the pandemic. And then as the pandemic tailed off, so did the business. And so they needed to keep themselves relevant to their customers. Now, as the world's largest meal kit delivery company, they had a ton of consumer data. They knew that, Michael, you substitute chicken for pork. I like things a little bit spicy. They had all that. They know how we had rated meals over the years, and yet they weren't using it.
Okay.
So, yeah, let's use this data. So historically, they had given their customers what they called the binder of choices for the next month's meals, and it was overwhelming. So they turned that on its head, and they started giving customers 5 to 10 options that were tailored to them, hyper specific based upon what they liked and what they had done. But so that rejuvenated the value proposition for customers, and that did great. But they realized that it didn't stop there. That was the start of the transformation. So if you're going to do that, that means then the kitchens, and they've got these massive kitchens, the kitchens can't just be producing 50 meals for the week. They're producing thousands of different variations of meals.
Mhm.
And that meant that the jobs in the kitchen had to change. Like a production manager, they weren't the jockey of the Excel model anymore, figuring out who's going to produce what when, because no human can do that for thousands of meals. They had to use AI too. So the production manager became the steward of the model. What is the AI not seeing? What context don't they have? How do I need to explain this to the frontline staff? How do we improve the model in the future? And then that ricocheted throughout the whole organization. Sourcing had to be different. You had to have a lot more ingredients. So they used decision science at the front of the value prop with the customer. And then it worked all the way back throughout the organization, really reshaping who it was and how they operated.
It's super interesting, and so you in your description there talked about they. But I'm curious if you've got anything you can share with us around who's leading that charge within the organization, what's the role of IT, and what kind of resistance they ran into.
Well, they actually hired as the CEO of North America, where they first did this, somebody from Amazon who had been responsible for offer customization. So they knew the direction they were going to go in, but they needed somebody who had done it before to make it really happen. His role as CEO, he's a general manager, but he's got the technical expertise to work closely with the tech teams to make it happen. Another context I write about in the book, Travelers Insurance. So there, the CTO is also the COO. And she has been able to drive IT into claims management, into underwriting processes. So there is a lot more customization of offers. There's a lot speedier decision making because she has both of those remits. Now, that's not always going to be possible. But I think the moral of the story here is that IT analytics, they definitely need a significant seat at the table, but they can't think about it as like their realm, right? There's a business problem that's being solved, and everybody's got to be solving that together.
What suggestions do you like? We've touched on this a little bit, but it came up when you were talking about your examples. It's like, what what do people need to think about? Like, what new skills do people need to build? What new skills do we need to teach in universities? Like, how should people get themselves ready for what the organizations of the future are going to look like?
So I've got 3 kids who are about to go to college, and I see more in their classmates, thankfully, than my kids. They are using ChatGPT all the time to get homework done.
Right.
And oh man, are they cheating themselves? Because they're losing the ability to have critical thinking. And the one thing you really need to get the most out of AI is critical thinking. Whether it's predictive or generative, agentic, or whatever, you need to be a
Right.
great. So we absolutely need to focus on that. We need to focus on change management because everybody's work is changing. There's a lot of fear out there and yes, resistance to change. Um, I think those 2 skills are going to be really important. Not everybody's going to be reimagining the organization. Some need to be, but not everybody. But everybody's got to learn how to work with these models in a critical way, spot what's missing, not just take it
Right.
as gospel, but spot what's missing. And then really think through both what broadly in the organization has to change and how do you bring people around to really making the change, not just doing it on paper.
I think we underestimate how hard change is in organizations, and particularly those of us that are where our facility is with abstraction. Abstraction we can change quickly and easily. The physical world is harder to wrestle with. Um, kind of on that note, uh, S- Steve, I'd love to get your sense of when is central coordination within the octopus vital, and how does that get recognized?
So defining decision rights, not, yeah, you'll need an org chart, fine, but who really decides what is really important. Otherwise, the human tendency is to be like those admirals in the 1930s and start dictating, or just sort of letting go of your own responsibilities and letting it filter back up the food chain to where it used to be, out of fear. So, who needs to decide what? How far can you go in terms of taking risk? All that needs to be defined. Look, there are some situations that call for more analytical approaches and others that are more agile. We talk in the book about how an octopus has 3 hearts, and organizations need different hearts for different purposes. Let me give you another military analogy. An Air Force pilot has a thick manual telling them exactly what they can do with their plane. A Navy aircraft carrier pilot has a thinner manual that tells them what they're not allowed to do with their plane. Because in the carrier landings, it gets a little hairy. It's very dynamic. The missions aren't often planned a whole lot in advance, and you need a lot of flexibility. Now, if you're undersea in a nuclear submarine, you don't get creative. You follow the dark manual, right? So
Right.
it's different strokes for different folks. You got to figure out where that agility is appropriate and where you need to be more disciplined. Thankfully, most of us don't work on nuclear submarines, so we can be a little bit more agile.
Right. So this leads to my next question about experimentation, because I've heard you talk about this too, where you kind of believe that, like, and you said it at the beginning too, like no one knows where this is going to go, like no one knows how it's all going to play out, and people, we can pretend like we do, but it's going to be a dynamic and kind of strange future. But how do we build this experimental muscle? Like, what do you mean by that, and sort of what tips would you give, and where do people go wrong when they think about experimenting?
So the bigger the organization, typically the worse they are at experimentation. And it's remarkable in pharma companies where the whole business is based on experimentation. That tends to be left in the labs, and the commercial part of
Okay.
the organization doesn't exist. So look, it's not that hard. We need to figure out, what are we trying to learn? Let's be a little targeted. Let's go back to eighth grade science class. What are we trying to learn? What are our hypotheses? What kind of data do we need to collect? What are the pre and post measures? How are we going to disseminate that data? How are we going to learn about surprises? Uh, and then here's a big one for big organizations. How do we stop experiments once we did the learning? Not have
Oh, that's a
experiments.
huge one. I've read so many companies I've seen. You just keep going, and it's just like once something starts, it's like hard to stop it.
So here's some real data from Johnson and Johnson. They counted up the number of pilots they had, AI pilots in the organization, and for sure it was an undercount. But they counted out about 900. And then they did rough approximation. How valuable is this? And 15% of those AI initiatives were delivering 85% of the value. So they had let 1,000 flowers bloom, and that was nice. Now they've moved on, and there is tighter discipline around things. They are chartering initiatives with more resources behind them that are going to be more valuable, but they're killing stuff off if it's not delivering value. Or, if you deliver the value and now it's done, now we need to go to something that's different in production scale.
So, as these last couple of questions, the word that's kept popping into my head is alignment. And I would imagine in this J&J case that these 900 initiatives, an awful lot of them were set up to optimize existing process level metrics. And how do you deal with the idea of metrics in a world where you've redesigned? And um, how do you avoid essentially this process level optimization and global tragedy?
That's a great way to put it, BJ. I think it comes down to focusing on, what workflows are you going to try to redo? Because most people are not, it's not in their job description to remake a cross-functional workflow. So there needs to be some governance entity that can say, okay, these are the half dozen things we're going to focus on for the next, whatever it is, 3 months. Really rethink how it's done, resource something appropriately. It doesn't take forever to build an AI system, at least, a basic one, right? Getting it to,
Right.
to production.
Takes less time than it did yesterday, right? And it keeps getting
Mhm.
faster.
That's right. Look, there's time on the back end, and we shouldn't discount that,
Sure.
right? That's the significant investment. But to just figure out, is this new flow going to work? That is pretty easy. So just get it done. And along with that, you measure impact, and you have people on in there who are relevant for that sort of thing, right? So have HR, in terms of performance metrics, have finance in there as well, right? And they're not going to be driving the ship, but they've got to have this awareness and to be on board too. Um, you know, i- i- Trying to do that in a huge way is going to court a lot of trouble. But saying, okay, we're going to do a half dozen things these next 3 months, that is a pretty safe way to start. And then you develop more confidence, and then you scale it up, and you move on.
So, where in that process, Steve, do organizations stop too short or quit too early? What have you seen?
Well, I don't think most can even get started. but look, they try to drive things to perfection. And that's going to create a lot of swirl and upset. They also can focus on the wrong things that might be important and high impact, but have a lot of external dependencies or are really complex, or there's a lot of edge cases. Those are things you often want to avoid, right? So get started, choose the right stuff. Don't try to make it perfect. Get your learnings, get your MVPs out the door, and then you can hone it later on. But don't lose your momentum, then keep going. The next things that you need to reform. Because, I mean, I tell you, the AI native companies are out there doing this already to you. There's a great article. I was in Harvard Business Review yesterday by Sangeet Paul Chowdhury, your neighbors over at Cal Berkeley. And he writes about Figma versus Adobe. And Adobe had all the right ideas about facilitating collaboration, but they were wed to this old way of working where designers would pass files around. And Figma totally rethought the system. They disaggregated the work into elements, and the elements could all be vetted and pre-approved. So you didn't need to approve the outputs if all the inputs were already pre-approved. And then everybody could collaborate using these elements all at once. And yeah, Figma got to be an extraordinarily valuable organization, not necessarily because they had any more insights or smart people than Adobe, but it just was able to reorganize the work. So don't let that happen to you, right? You may not be able to create your own internal startup, but you can at least fix up some stuff in the organization and then go move on and do the next stuff.
Yeah, I've actually seen this. I've seen this in the transition to cloud quite a bit as well. And now we're seeing this notion of AI native versus the cloud people are the incumbents now.
Yeah, I want to dig in one other way you have of getting out creativity, and you talk about the VC market, like using the VC model. And I have to confess, when I first read the first sentence, you said, "Oh, you should look like a VC." I thought, "Oh, you're going to talk about portfolio," which you kind of just talked about now. But you meant something deeper than just looking at how VCs think about a portfolio. You looked at how VCs analyze a market to look at like what Figma did, just analyze something different. Can you expand on that a little bit to give us some insight there on that kind of thinking?
Yeah, well, look, it happens in a few ways, right? VCs look at tensions that are resolving, the good ones, right? They're not just going to say, I'm going to bet on this new technology because, yeah, that's going to shift, right? They're looking
Right.
at tensions like, okay, AI data centers are using an inordinate amount of energy. I did a profile on a VC fund that's
Okay.
looking at this. So, okay, that's not sustainable. So, what are the nodes where they can invest where you might be able to affect the energy usage by AI, right? So they'll do that. They will come in with an expectation of failure, but they'll fail very fast and very cheaply. And then the winners are enough to power the whole success of the portfolio. They are ruthless about killing the zombies. And most ideas are zombies. They're not outright failures necessarily, but they sort of are like staggering along, half alive, half dead.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, whack them on the head with the shovel. They, they VCs kill them off, and then they really double down on what works. So those are not corporate behaviors, but that is it's been proven. But for decades, VCs have proven this model works. So don't act like a big corporation. Don't act like a startup either inside a big corporation because that's just usually not feasible. Act like a venture capitalist.
Yeah. Okay. I like that advice. I like the tension was interesting. There was a famous guy in operations research. I think it was Russell Ackoff, and
Yes.
he used to say like you want to predict out to see what's not going to happen. That's what you're saying. Like if you look at energy prices, energy consumption, like what's not going to happen. It's like like the bunch of stuff's not going to happen, and let's get ahead of that and build our solutions to solve that problem.
Right. I mean, this is all around us, right? Healthcare costs cannot keep going up 10% a year, right? That's not going to happen. So, where are
Right.
the breaking points? What are the tensions that need to get resolved?
That's perfect.
I would have said 2005 on the healthcare thing. And so it is kind of defying gravity in some ways. Sooner
Well,
or later, we've got to
So
crack.
Steve, let's wrap up, and if you can tell the audience sort of where they can find more information about you and which your books they should check out.
All right. Well, the book we mainly talked about is AI and the Octopus Organization. It's available on Amazon, and the website is aiandtheoctopus.com. We also talked about Jobs to Be Done. That has been out 10 years now, and it still sells quite well. So
Congratulations. That's
you can
great.
find that on, well, Amazon, many other outlets, and they're available as audiobooks, ebooks, whatever sort of format you want. You can find me at my company, New Markets Advisors, and my LinkedIn. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Stephen Wunker. I do reply to messages, so tell me what you're up to, tell me what you're thinking, and I'm happy to get back to you.
Steve, thanks for joining us. And I'm equally inspired by the octopus after our conversation as I was before. A great metaphor, and looking forward to the book.
You bet. I hope you never eat octopus again.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for your time. We really
Next
appreciate it.
time, everybody.